Today in the garage, we're going to be doing something that's a little bit different, a little bit interesting, something that I really can't find any information online for. And you've probably seen this truck before at this point, maybe. It's a K5 Blazer 1989. The thing that's unique about it is it has a 6.2 diesel engine in it. It originally was a Forest Service vehicle, but that's not important. Fact of the matter is, it's a diesel truck, and I like to have a tachometer on all of my vehicles for when I'm doing mountain grades or going wheeling or just highway drives. I like to know where I'm shifting at and what RPM the engine's at. So all my gas trucks, it's super easy. You know, most vehicles come with them. The Cherokees all come with them. 4Runners have had come with them. None of the square bodies came with tachs. You can put one in really easy on a gasoline vehicle. I've showed a video on how to do that on a 91 K5 a few years ago now. But on diesels, there is no electronic ignition. It's a lot different. So you can't just hook it up to the tach wire or the pulse wire on the distributor. You've got to find another way to do it. And the route I'm going is through the alternator. I've not been able to find really any videos on this. So I'm gonna actually have to take the alternator out of the truck. Not that difficult, but it's more work than I wanted it to be. We're gonna need to split the case. We're gonna need to go into these 3 terminals on the alternator, and I'll talk more about that later once I get on the bench. And I'll show you where to hook it up and where to run your signal wire to. And you do have to buy like a diesel specific tack to do this. So I'm gonna stop talking. I'll show you what's going on in the truck, and then we'll get to work. Here's your alternator. It's on the driver's side. It is on the driver's side as well for the gasoline vehicles. Now, I haven't actually looked at this more than what I'm looking at right now, but it looks the exact same configuration as the gasoline alternator would be to take it on and off. There's a sliding nut right here that locks it down, so you're gonna wanna loosen that up. There's gonna be another bolt on the bottom side. I believe it's like 15 millimeter. Okay, I'll try to show it to you if I can get, well, let me just point it out because you won't be able to see it, it's too dark. But you see this bracket here, there's a bolt somewhere around right there. It might be 15 millimeter or 9/16, something like that, maybe 5/8. That's what you need to loosen up so that this thing will kind of rotate back and forth. And you're gonna need to pull all of those. Well, you'll loosen it up, take the belt off, then you can pull these bolts actually all the way off and probably undo the electrical connections on the back, and we should be able to just slide it out. I may have to move some of this stuff out of my way or wiggle it around the heater core hoses. But it looks like the same as removing a gasoline alternator. So I'm gonna get doing that right now. As promised, the alternator is out of the truck. Came out really easily. There's a couple brackets. Everything is 13 and 15 millimeter, at least that's what I used. I got it on my workbench now, the 66 Mustang. And we're gonna split open the case. So I believe what you're looking for is the W terminal on an alternator. If you're doing this on, I think, a Cummins or different diesel trucks, your alternator may have a W terminal on the back here, or it may just have like a case that you can pop off and have access to any one of these posts, which would basically act as the W terminal. I don't think many have a physical W terminal on the back poking out. You got to go into the alternator for the most part. Now, unfortunately, with the Chevy one, we need to split the case down the middle. So it's going to be these bolts. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. You're going to want to take them all out. I'm going to do that now. I might use some penetrating fluid down there. You can see the bolt sticking through, just so that I don't break anything. And then we're going to take this case off, and then I'll show you the terminals. All of the case bolts are 5/16. Okay, this next part is very interesting and very important. And inside the alternator, you're going to have springs. And you're really not going to know when you're splitting the case. You're not going to know exactly what's happening or where they come from. But I'm going to try to get in here. Okay. You see this case? It goes pretty deep. It's got 2 holes in it. And see if you can see this guy right here that I'm touching and pushing in. You can see it's worn and curved as if it's rotating, a shaft is rotating around it on one side. That side needs to be poking out. It's connected by a little small copper wire, and then this side goes in the hole. But they're spring loaded, so you can see this spring down here. The second one is sitting out right up top there, and the spring is halfway poking out of the hole. So as you pull it apart, the spring, there's nothing holding this contact piece, so it's just gonna flop out and the springs are gonna go kind of sitting in here. You need to shove those springs back down in the hole, and then you need to put these pieces on top of the spring and hold them down while you're reassembling the case. I'll show you how I do that once I put it back together. But when you're in here, what you need access to for your, your W terminal for the alternator feed wire is any one of these 3 posts here. And you're just going to use a normal circular wire terminal, whatever gauge, 16, 14, 18 gauge. And you're going to unscrew that bolt, and then you're going to put your new wire in there with the send wire going to your alternator, and then you'll go ahead and put the bolt back down and then run it out one of these little vents or outlet holes. So I'm going to do that now. I'll measure my length for my wire, for my tack send wire, and then I'll show you how I put this guy back together. This shaft goes into the bearing, basically the pulley on the front of the alternator right here. These 2 pieces are what those little black contact pieces slide up against. It's this shaft, not this one. Here's what my wire looks like. You can see it riding right there. It's bolted underneath that nut right there. And then it goes out this vent hole that you can see my finger messing around with back here. So it's going to be right next to my electrical clip. And that should be out of the way. Now I'll show you what I'm going to do to get the springs lined back up while I put the case back together. Okay, we are ready to reassemble the case. There's a sight hole right on the front. The springs are beneath it, and those contact pieces are beneath this cotter pin. This is what I use to shove through this hole. It goes clear all the way through to the back of the case. So I'm going to basically pick it up right now. Let's see if I can show it to you. Can you get the light down a little bit more? Right there. So you see those holes? The cotter pin runs through, and all my contact pieces are held down by the cotter pin underneath it. And it's sticking out the backside. So now I'm going to reassemble the case into that shaft, and then I'll pull the cotter pin out at the end. You could use a drill bit if you got that. Whatever you can use to hold the stuff down. Okay, I just pulled the cotter pin out of this hole here, and you can kind of feel it click. You can feel the springs launch up when you pull it out, and then you can spin the thing. You shouldn't hear any weird binding or grinding. So now you've got your wire hanging out the back. What I'm going to do is reinstall it, and I will just temporarily, with alligator clips, wire up my tack, and then we'll test it on the truck and see if it works. Okay, we're inside now, and I'm going to show you the plan for putting the gauge right in here. This is what I usually do when I wire in either a tranny temp gauge or tachometer or any sort of gauge. I try to find a 52 millimeter, I think it's a 2-inch gauge, and I always use this blank slot. Sometimes there'll be a clock in here depending on the package you get with your square body, but I think this is the cleanest way. I don't like drilling them or mounting them on the dash or the steering column because it doesn't look quite right to me, and I like using this blank pocket here, and it's really easy to do if you modify it. So I'll show you how I do that, and first thing is going to be to take this plastic cover off. I've already loosened all of the screws. They are 1/4 all the way around. Go ahead and take those guys out, and then you'll remove this cover off. Now when you're in here, it's a great idea to clean all this out. You can see a ton of dust. Let's see, a ton of dust in there and underneath on these gauges. Clean all that off so it's real nice and smooth and shiny when you're in here now, and it'll make it worthwhile in the long run. The other thing you're going to want to do while you've got this guy out is check all of your lights. They're on the back side of this, and here's one for example right here. You've got a ton of these little, hopefully we didn't break anything. You got a ton of these little pop-in lights. You just twist them counterclockwise to take them out, and then check the bulb. This bulb looks fine. so we can set them back in here and turn them clockwise to turn them back in. Check all your bulbs, there's like 8 or 9 of them when you're back here, and replace them now if needed. Alright, here it is with the plastic cover and the plastic bezel removed. You do have to remove your transmission indicator, the park, reverse, neutral, drive, that one right there from here to be able to slide out the cover. And here's the empty slot. Now, if you've got, the only ones I've seen this on, and I've seen it on all 91s, is this thing will actually be like honeycombed inside of here. There's like a plastic, I don't know, support or webbing or something. It's not a blank hole here. The 91 trucks have that. 2 91 trucks that I've done this with, I've had to get rid of a bunch of webbing in here, and I used a soldering iron and melted through it and just pulled it all out. You can use a Dremel to cut through this stuff. I've used a razor blade. It's brittle, old 30-year-old plastic. You can razor blade through it. I'm going to use a hole saw and a Dremel just because I've got it right now. So I'm going to cut out this hole here, and then over here on this plastic, this is where you really want to make sure you've got your precise circle drawn and cut that out perfectly with the razor blade or whatever you need to do. Make sure it's a tight fit, because that's what you're going to sandwich the gauge in between with this plastic retainer and the actual gauge. It's going to get squished between this thin little, it almost feels like a to-go container or something. It's very thin plastic, but take my word for it, it does hold the gauge just fine. I've done thousands of miles with trucks that I've done this with, and a ton of wheeling as well. So I'm going to start cutting out this plastic first, and then I'll cut my hole over here, and we can kind of put things back together. Fits pretty well so far. So, okay, the gauge, I'm done cutting out the bezel. You can see that it's snug, but the thing does drop in here, and this is what you want. See it coming out the back side. We just want it as some secondary support so that the back of it isn't really flopping around trying to wiggle out this, because this is what we're going to cut now with the razor blade, and then that'll allow me to sandwich it in there. So I actually cut this, well, I razor bladed it and then I Dremeled it, but the fit is, you know, so perfect, quote unquote, that I'm having to actually thread it through, and that's fine, that works great. But this is plenty strong enough, this little plastic thing, to hold your gauge when the back of it is supported by the actual bulk of the gauges. So this will be plenty strong enough. We're still going to put this back piece over here to cinch everything down, but that'll hold everything in there nice and good to go. Okay, here is the finished product. Let's see, here's the gauge right here. It's kind of blurry, it's almost hard to see because of the reflection. Can't really block the lights out, but you can see through there. I cleaned everything up. Here's the back side. It doesn't fully stick through, but it's kind of supported a bit on the top, and then there's the wires coming out. So it is lifted up a tiny bit on this side, the plastic, because the face of the gauge sticks out a little bit further than prior gauges I've used, but that's how you're gonna swap these guys in. One other thing here, another pro tip, is if you've got an automatic, now's a good time to grease this little thing if yours is still connected and not completely broken. Mine still has a little bit of metal in there. It's a good time to grease up this sliding piece here so that it reduces friction when you're shifting gears. This will likely be the last clip of the diesel tack install for this K5 Blazer. So just, I've almost got the dash put back together now here. I gotta tie up a couple things, but basically you can see how it looks and it sits. I've got a huge light on here and it's really blinding everything else, but there's the gauge in there, and then you can see it's really clear. I do have a crack in my plastic cover, but other than that, you can see the reflective glare of this giant light. But otherwise, it looks really good. All of the gauges work, everything's back together, all the wiring is tied up in here. I will run you through that real quick. I'll show you as much as I can. Okay, let's see. How much can I show you? So, well, I'll tell you how I do this, because a lot of the wiring has been zip tied up. You can kind of see a bunch of it there.
But what I'll do when I'm wiring up aftermarket stuff is on these fuse boxes down by your foot, there's usually going to be some empty slots that say ignition or battery. You want to find the ones that are ignition, well, depending on what you're doing. When you're doing something like this and you don't want it to constantly have power and drain your battery, you want to wire it to ignition. So it's right up above, it's right in that dark spot. See if I can get more light. Ah, okay, you see it. So you see those things going in. It's 2 brown wires, and it's got electrical tape and it's soldered, and it goes into a port. That's for ignition. So whenever my key turns on, whatever's wired up to that will have power. Now, I've wired up 2 different things. One of them is the automatic window over here because my factory stuff was messed up. And then the other one, that's why it's split 2 ways, the other one goes to my gauge. That's the hot wire. Now I jumped the positive terminal for the light on my gauge also over to the power, so my gauge is always lit, and I always do that just because it's easier than finding the illumination wire. Now my ground, it goes right over there. It's behind that. It's just a bolt on the firewall. And then my send wire it's a green one. You can see it right there, and it gets spliced into my red wire that I ran in the engine bay. And that's how you wire up the tach. It's really straightforward. I'll show you the engine bay in a second here. But that's really it. And then you'll notice it looks really clean, really good. There's no gauges sticking up on your dash. There's nothing, or on your column. There's nothing bolted to your dash or by this A-pillar. I hate it when that stuff's hanging there. Now, there's one other thing I'm going to show you real quick that I do on these square bodies, just because I hate having gauges poking out of places. I like it to look as factory as possible, and I've found another way to hide one more gauge in here. So check this out. This is my cigarette lighter and your ashtray. Now, I don't smoke, and I don't know if people still ash in their ashtrays in their car. The cigarette lighter is still there and fully functional, but we've also got this gauge right here. That's going to be a transmission temperature gauge, and I'll make another video on how I installed that. But all the wiring is tucked behind the radio, and it runs all back behind the dash, and that's also wired to ignition. And if I don't want to see the transmission temperature, just go ahead and close that, and it still looks very factory and stock. So I'll make a video on how I did that gauge. But real quick, let's try to run over to the engine bay and see if I can show you some of the quote-unquote finished product. Still not completely finished. I'm gonna wrap this red wire in some wiring loom, but it goes right into the alternator. It doesn't hit anything. Now, if I was smarter, if I had measured better, I would not have run this across the front of my engine. I would have ran it directly back here on the firewall and then tied it over. I just didn't have enough room to do that. I ran out of room, basically. So I may end up redoing that once I get the wiring loom, but for now, that's how it's gonna sit, and that's how you install a diesel tachometer on a Chevy square body.